Good afternoon and welcome to the November 13th, 2024 City Council Work Session. Thank you for joining us in this virtual meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. Thank you again for joining us. And with that, I call this work session to order, and we'll turn it over to the city manager to introduce the first item.
It's like we're in the chambers. Unmute. Our first item is a follow-up conversation on our climate-friendly areas and selection process for that. And I believe that this is going to be kicked off by either Leah or Terry. Terry? Awesome. Thank you, Terry.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, counselors. I'm Terry Harding. I'm the principal planner with Community Planning and Design. And I'm here with Leah Rausch to talk to you about climate-friendly areas. And Leah's gonna share her screen. Thank you. So the topic of our work session today is to move forward local implementation of the state program known as Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities, or CFEC. This afternoon, I'll review the climate-friendly areas, how they fit into urban growth strategies, and Eugene's ongoing planning for mixed-use compact development. And then Leah Rausch will talk in more detail about climate-friendly area requirements and the 3 staff proposed options that we developed and you heard about in September. And then the staff and planning commission recommendations. And then we'll have plenty of time for your questions, discussion, and possible direction. As a reminder, there are 3 phases of the Urban Growth Strategies project that we're integrating this CFA work into. Identify Eugene's needs and priorities for housing, then study what land is needed for jobs, housing, parks, schools, and infrastructure, and using what was learned, create and update the regulations, guidelines, and maps for using land in Eugene. As you all know, Eugene has been planning for compact development for a long time. Climate-friendly areas align with many of the City Council's ongoing priorities, including implementing the Envision Eugene community vision and completing our comprehensive plan. Urban growth strategies also include several projects that align with the housing implementation pipeline, CAP 2.0 actions, the city's current strategic plan, and the council goal for sustainable and accountable development. So since Eugene's vision already calls for focusing future growth and investment in and near mixed-use centers to provide convenient access to daily needs, how do climate-friendly areas fit into this picture? Well, the legislation is fairly recent, and due to that being done at the state level, Eugene needs to pick some of these areas to be designated as CFAs by the end of next year. Climate-friendly areas under the state requirements are the most dense areas of a city with the tallest buildings like you would see in downtown, not just Eugene, but around the state. Eugene's mixed-use centers are envisioned to be convenient and climate-friendly, connected with high-quality infrastructure for people walking, biking, riding the bus, and driving, and comfortable and safe. The city is planning for 3 different types of centers. They are the downtown center, core commercial centers, and neighborhood centers. For today, we're focusing on which centers should be designated as the city's official climate-friendly areas, starting with the downtown. And for more information on how CFAs could play out in Eugene, I'll hand it over to Leah.
Awesome. Thank you, Terry. Good afternoon, Mayor and councilors. Again, my name's Leah Rausch. I'm the senior planner in the planning division. As Terry said, I'm here today to help you all take the next step in the city's implementation of the climate-friendly areas component of CFEC. So again, this is a specific designation that's directed by state administrative rules, and a climate-friendly area is intended to be an area where people can meet most of their daily needs without relying on a car. So Terry grounded us a little bit in Eugene's vision for mixed-use centers. Climate-friendly areas fit into this framework, and I would think of them as one of the most intense urbanized versions of a mixed-use center. Climate-friendly areas allow for the tallest buildings. They have the highest density of housing, jobs, and services. They have frequent 15-minute transit service. They have great walking and biking facilities. And again, they have that mix of urban uses. This state designation really is intended for downtowns and core urban centers within cities across the state. Luckily, as Terry said, this is a concept that we're very familiar with here in Eugene. And we already allow for taller buildings and a mix of uses in many parts of our city. Our task today is to figure out which of those many areas will get this official state designation right off the bat. And staff have really worked to focus on the areas that will require the lightest touch to bring into compliance with the state's requirements. So what does this designation actually do? Ultimately, CFA designation really tries to marry zoning and development regulations with transportation improvements. By designating a CFA, Eugene will update our housing and transportation plans to first revise our development regulations to ensure the areas have opportunities for higher density mixed-use development with a focus on housing, non-auto-oriented commercial, and public serving uses. Then we'll identify and prioritize improvements that make it easier and safer for people to walk, bike, and take transit to their destinations. And we'll implement strategies to avoid or minimize the displacement of residents who may be vulnerable to housing instability, as well as increase and preserve affordable housing options. CFA designation does not, unfortunately, come with automatic additional state funding to support these needed improvements. That means any investments that we need to support higher density development, to mitigate displacement, or to improve transportation would need to be locally supported. Our process to designate climate-friendly areas has had 3 steps. In 2023, we identified and studied the most promising locations for climate-friendly areas across the city based on the state's requirements. This year, we're looking for you all to select areas to designate, and then staff will begin the process of preparing an adoption package, including our typical kind of plan and code amendments. Climate-friendly areas will serve as a strategy for more efficient use of land within our urban growth boundary moving forward. Each time we revisit the UGB, which is now every 8 years for housing needs, we'll also revisit our designated climate-friendly areas and continue designating more areas as we grow. So starting with step 1 in that process, the city's CFA study, we used quite a few different evaluation criteria to narrow down the parts of the city that are the best fit for this specific designation. Our key narrowing criteria that I'll hit on today included our current zoning and development regulations. So really looking at, is the area planned as a high density mixed use center? We looked at active transportation and transit, so both existing and planned facilities and services. And we looked at development and redevelopment conditions. So can the area support the types of development that are intended for climate-friendly areas? There are some other important considerations highlighted in the study that I won't get into today, including proximity to parks and public amenities and housing displacement risk. So across all of our different zones that already allow for higher density and mixed use development, we wanted to understand the changes that we would need to make to bring our current zoning into compliance with the state CFA standards. As I mentioned, areas designated as CFAs must allow for a mix of housing, non-auto-oriented, and public serving uses. They'll have to have a minimum residential density, and buildings will be allowed to be taller in these areas. In short, our existing higher intensity commercial zones, so C2 and C3, are the best fit, as relatively small changes will be needed in these zones to come into compliance with the state standards. So we also wanted to consider the places that are really the most ready to develop with this kind of climate-friendly areas standards in mind. So we worked with a contractor to complete a redevelopment analysis of many of our study areas, primarily those locations with that compliant commercial zoning and with existing frequent transit service as shown in this map. The analysis approach and key results are summarized in attachment A of your packet. and the detailed results by study area are available in attachment B. The analysis considers 12 different development types, ranging from commercial development to higher density mixed use and residential development types. The analysis was intended to support other components of urban growth strategies as well, inclusive of CFA designation. And because we anticipate minimal regulatory changes from CFA designation in these areas, kind of commercially zoned areas, we use this analysis as an opportunity to understand the impact of financial incentives to encourage higher density, mixed use, and housing development. We tested a 10-year tax incentive exemption, something similar to MUPD, as our primary financial incentive. In short, the analysis found that a few of our study areas have the potential to support higher density and vertical mixed-use development, including Greater Downtown and the commercial area around Lower Coburg Road. With additional incentives, Midtown and the commercial areas around South Willamette and Valley River Center could also support this type of development. There are also some other study areas that could support more horizontal mixed-use development, so kind of side-by-side commercial with housing, including the commercial areas around Santa Clara Station and possibly West 11th. I'm not going to get into the detailed results of the analysis today, but we'll continue bringing it back to you alongside our housing production work within urban growth strategies. So based on the results of the CFA study and the redevelopment analysis, staff proposed 3 options for CFA designation, which we presented to you at a work session in September. Tonight, this afternoon, we're asking council to select a preferred option for areas to designate. We're taking this interim step prior to final decision-making, so we have enough direction to begin the development of our adoption package, including our typical land use process and other supporting work within urban growth strategies. All of that information will lead us into our adoption process in 2026, where you'll make your final decision. As a reminder, here are the 3 options we brought to you in September, which are summarized in more detail in attachment D of your packet with detailed maps in attachment D, summary in attachment C, maps in attachment D. The first option meets the minimum state requirements, which focus primarily on Greater Downtown Eugene, including the downtown core, the 5th Street area, and Midtown, but does not include the riverfront. It also includes the commercial area around Lower Coburg Road to get us to the state minimum requirements. The second option is expanded to include some core commercial centers that are most likely to see climate-friendly redevelopment based on the results of the redevelopment analysis, including the commercial areas around Valley River Center, South Willamette, and Santa Clara Station. The third option is expanded even further to include commercial corridors that would need and could benefit from additional investment and incentives to see more climate-friendly like redevelopment, including 6th and 7th and the West 11th Avenue corridors. We brought the complete results of the CFA study, the redevelopment analysis, and community engagement to the Planning Commission over the last few months. They recommended option 2 for CFA designation. Option 2 is a middle ground. It allows the city to exceed the state's minimum requirements while starting CFA designation in core commercial centers that are more ready to see higher density mixed-use development. The city can then assess the successes and challenges to making these areas more climate-friendly when CFA designation is revisited in 8 years, again, as a part of our state-required housing planning. Staff and the Planning Commission believe that CFA designation alone will not be enough to address the needs of auto-centric commercial corridors, including 6th and 7th, West 11th, or Highway 99. We know that zoning alone doesn't get us the development we'd like to see, and they'll need substantial investment first using other city tools. For these reasons and others documented in your AIS, staff and the Planning Commission recommend option 2, which allows the city to exceed the state minimum requirements while using the CFA designation efficiently and effectively. During your last work session, councilors asked for more granular maps to understand areas for possible designation. This slide and the next provide draft maps showing draft boundaries of the areas included in option 2 based on their current contiguous zoning. Maps for all three options, again, are provided in attachment D of your packet today. More work will be done in 2025 to refine these boundaries and determine the specific tax lots to be included once council identifies your preferred option, including how to treat public lands and historic properties. The first slide shows the greater downtown and lower Coburg Road areas. And then this slide shows the 3 commercial areas that are also within option 2, which again are all zoned C2 community commercial, which is shown in pink here, and which you'll recall is very compliant with the state's CFA standards. Again, these are just draft boundaries based on kind of our current zoning boundaries. So today we're looking for your preferred areas to designate as climate-friendly areas. And in 2025, once we have the areas identified, we'll focus on some of the work to actually implement CFAs through urban growth strategies, including drafting policies in the comprehensive plan related to centers and key corridors more broadly, looking at strategies to mitigate potential housing displacement, completing a multimodal transportation gap analysis in our CFAs, which will identify and consider the needed improvements for people walking, biking, and taking transit, and then any changes we need to make to our existing policies, so primarily the land use code and the comprehensive plan, to get this ready for adoption in 2026. We'll come back to you several times in 2025 on urban growth strategies work, and with a special focus on strategies to meet our current and future housing need. So with that, I will stop my presentation and we will open it up for your questions and discussion. I'll hand it back to the mayor.
Thank you so much. I raised my own hand unnecessarily, but thank you for that very succinct presentation. And I see that Mike already has his hand up. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you. And then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. Thank you for all the work. I recognize that the state has handed you almost a full employment act worth of work here. And I personally would prefer to tell the state to stick it in their ear, but that's a whole other matter. In the analysis looking at option 2 versus option 1, I noted one of the things you said about state funding not being a part of this mandate. So is choosing option, I'll try and make this question as simple as possible, but isn't choosing option 2 considerably more expensive on a local basis for the city of Eugene than choosing option 1?
It's a good question. There is not a lot of cost to designating areas as climate friendly. The minimal code amendments we would need to make in C2, which is consistent across all of those areas, are pretty small tweaks. And we'd have to make those tweaks kind of regardless of whether we go with option 1 or option 2. Designating them does not require us to make any additional investments. We will need to do that transportation gap analysis and look at what are the gaps and identify those gaps across all of our areas, but and those will make their way into our transportation plans.
Do you anticipate that the transportation gap analysis for Lower Coburg Road will reflect a good deal of work that needs to be done by the city of Eugene?
I think so, yeah. Yes, so I think there will be more transportation improvements identified in the more areas we look at, but our transportation planners have kind of noted that interest and priority in making improvements across the city, and this will just fit into our current transportation system plan and plans for improvements over many years.
And lastly, choosing option 1 fully complies with the state mandate. Am I correct?
That's correct.
I might make such a motion to substitute. If I have a second, I'll speak to it at the time. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Randy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you very much for the presentation. And I also want to thank you again for providing more detailed maps. I think that helps help us evaluate this. I'm kind of in the same place Councillor Clark is. I don't think we have a really good track record of going beyond the minimums. I think I'd like to start with the minimums and see how that goes, and then move on from there. I recognize in the long haul we're going to have to go beyond that, but it just seems like we continually bite off more than we can chew, and I would kind of like to just take the minimal bite and see how that goes as we progress. So if Councillor Clark makes that motion, I will second that. Thank you.
Okay, Alan and then Greg.
Yeah, again, just to be clear, this is not a city initiative. This is coming from the state, DLCD, and this is a state mandate, correct?
Correct.
And-
It's one component of the climate friendly and equitable communities rules.
Right, and there is no do nothing option for us. We have to initiate one of these options. We don't get to do nothing.
Correct.
And the tools to implement the climate friendly areas, besides rezoning, then then there's incentives, right? So incentives really for housing are basically MUPTI. Are there other incentives besides MUPTI that?
Yeah, I mean, there are some other kind of housing related incentives, tax exemptions we could look at, and we're looking at as a part of the housing production work within urban growth strategies. MUPTI is the one that we tested. A 10-year tax exemption is what we tested in the redevelopment analysis, because that's something we're familiar with here, but there are some other kind of comparable options.
Yeah, so currently MUPTI is only in the downtown core. It's not in the Coburg area, so that would be expansion there. In option 2, it would be expanding MUPTI into the Santa Clara area, the Valley River Center area, the South Willamette area. Option 3 would add it into the 6th and 7th corridor and the West 11th corridor. This would be a massive expansion of MUPTI moving forward if we chose to go anywhere besides go with any other option. Option 1, the costs are the opportunity costs of MUPTI that Mike was going, but also the transportation improvement system charges or system developments that's going to occur are going to potentially be big ticket items. I hearken back to the public opposition we got to rezoning in the South Willamette, and lessons learned from that about going slow and testing things out on a smaller scale, and then expanding later. So going with option 1 kind of fits that model for me, where you start off with a smaller scale. Downtown already has MUPTI. We talk about Coburg, whether or not that gets it or not, but and that would be part of it. But seeing how all this goes, I don't think CFEC is actually as well thought out as people think it is, and I think that, albeit dumped on our planning staff to implement, but the rest of it is I don't think as well thought out as it could have been, and as a mandate onto us. And my guess is that there's going to be, especially in a Trump era, there's going to be a hell of a lot of opposition to this kind of stuff. And my preferred option would be to go slow, expand if it works, and turns out better later. So I'd be in favor of option 1 as well, especially given the massive expansion of MUPTI that this would require.
Yeah, and thank you, Councilor Zelenka. I just want to be really clear that by deciding to designate an area as a climate-friendly area, you would not be deciding to extend MUPTI.
Yeah, I get
It's
that.
something you all could do.
Right, but it's the only incentive we have. So what would be the point?
Yeah, and in terms of the rezoning, I just want to be clear that areas we're looking at are already zoned C2 or C3. And so really the tweak to the zoning would be including a minimum residential density. But for the most part, these areas already comply with the standards.
Right, that was true first round of South Willamette as well.
Okay, thank you. Greg, then Lindsay and Jennifer.
I'm unmuted. Okay. Thanks, Mayor. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna try to take this in a little bit of a different direction. I'm gonna go down the transportation rabbit hole. Recently, LTD received a grant from FTA for mobility management, and specifically integrating different pieces of the transportation scheme across the city and across the district, integrating different forms of transportation into and with the fixed route service that LTD provides. Can you talk about what conversations you may or may have not had in regard to how this particular grant and mobility management works with how we're moving forward with these plans?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I will say this, the climate friendly areas study and the climate friendly areas rules are pretty focused on frequent fixed route transit. So they look at 15-minute or 4 times an hour service as kind of the standard we would be working towards in climate friendly areas. There is not really a broader consideration of mobility management in the CFEC, in this component of the CFEC rules. I will say CFEC broadly looks at transportation planning and will inform our upcoming transportation system plan update. So just thinking about climate friendly areas, though, it's pretty specific to that frequent fixed route transit. It'll also
one of the things that I'm interested in is, because this grant is a pilot project, is how do we interface the components of this grant into this particular frameworks. In other words, okay, I understand, you know, that we're basing this on the fixed route 15-minute frequency service, but mobility management would increase the frequency as well as the depth of access that we have, and it would give us a good opportunity to be able to see how mobility management interfaces with the fixed route system and with our plans around climate action and growth.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Councilor Evans. I don't think I'm prepared to answer it today. What we could look at doing is, in this multimodal transportation gap analysis we'll be required to do in our climate friendly areas, that transportation planning team will lead that work. And they could certainly consider more broadly mobility management within that analysis. But outside of that, we would have to follow up with you with guidance from the transportation planning team.
Yeah, that would be great. I suggest that we have continued conversations with LTD about this particular grant and what effects it would have on, you know, these plans moving forward if we are looking to you know, increase the range and depth of our transportation platform.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you so much. I mean, I love the idea behind a lot of these things. I definitely want to make our city more walkable, bikeable, and, you know, this is potentially a good tool to do that, but we don't know that. And it feels like a lot all at once. And, you know, a couple weeks back, our last work session, it was kind of clear to me that staff were kind of saying, hey, like, we have a lot on our plate with a lot of these different things, and there might have to be a choice that's made between some of the very important things that we're trying to do to implement in our city that addresses significant challenges. You know, that work session was about annexation and about, you know, parking, and we were kind of told, hey, we might not have the time to be able to do that work because of all these other requirements. To me, that those are really big challenges that we need to address. And so I don't mind taking this a little bit more slowly and seeing how it's functioning and working, and giving a little bit more breath to it. When is the next opportunity then to choose designated areas? Do we have to do it only at the 8-year intervals, or is that something that we can do by saying, hey, like this is super successful actually, and we would like to expand it? What opportunities do we have with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Councilor Leach. No, there's no reason we couldn't revisit it sooner than 8 years. We will be required when we do our housing planning work to demonstrate that we're continuing to meet the threshold established by the state. So that's when we'll have to kind of prove our work. But we could certainly look at it earlier than that, potentially in alignment with another transportation planning project or something like that. I don't have a particular benchmark in mind, but yes, we could look at it sooner.
Great. My other question is like, I mean, I love the idea of development of the Valley River Center area. That huge, massive parking lot, it has a lot of potential. I don't know how to get us from, it's a bit huge mall parking lot to actual housing. But one thing I can see is that, well, to actually meet the requirements of this being like the majority of people's needs being met within this walkable distance. I mean, the mall doesn't meet all of the needs of a person. So we're, how do we require like a grocery store, a pharmacy, childcare? Like these are the actual real needs of being a walkable neighborhood. Like how does that work happen where we can't require certain businesses to move in, but that's what's kind of the design of this program.
Yeah, you're right, Councilor Leach. We can't require, a grocery store to locate on the mall parking lot. And I think you all know, and we mentioned, the zoning alone isn't going to get us to kind of this more climate-friendly development, redevelopment future. So we would need to see Valley River Center kind of redevelop to be more walkable, bikeable, have those different resources. It would need to be a more concerted effort, I think, beyond the zoning changes, or even a financial incentive. It would need to be that package of transportation improvements, and malls in particular redevelop differently. They don't redevelop kind of parcel by parcel like you might see in a more neighborhood scale. So it would need to be a more, I think, concerted planning effort in that area in particular.
Yeah, and yeah, like I said, I love the idea of that complete redevelopment, but I think the process to get there is just so long term. I would support, I think at this point, option 1 with kind of the knowledge that we're able to look at the successes and make changes as we see that it makes sense, and continue to designate into the future. So thank you for all your work. This was a really great presentation and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks to all the staff who have got us to this place. I also really appreciate the concept and the ultimate goals that this is trying to reach. And I know community members don't want to have to go way out of town, way out of their area, as some folks do, to reach important services. But I also agree with my colleagues that taking on too much is not a good idea at this point. I'm very much not interested in option number 3. I was kind of on the fence on the other 2, but this conversation has been really helpful for me. So I'm also in favor of option number 1. I also had the same question as Councilor Leach. Do we have to wait 8 years? And it sounds like the answer is not necessarily. We have the option to revisit this, and if it's going really well and we learn a lot from our first endeavors in this and we feel comfortable taking that next step, we have the power and the opportunity to do that as it makes sense for our community and our resources. So I also don't know what that timeline would be that we should come back, but I do think sooner than 8 years, having a check-in and evaluation and just giving us a chance to talk about this would be warranted, and that would be my preference. Yeah, I think that's it, and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Matt?
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks, colleagues. I share the sentiments and echo the support for moving forward cautiously, considering some of the fallout and expenses that came with local implementation of housing policy reform over the last 4 to 5 years. Becca's informing me I'm being really loud in the hospital waiting room. I apologize. I'm coming to you from Riverbend, yet again, a place we're getting to know all too well. I'll be floating option one, and I'm cautious about advancing incentives for non-tier 1 transit corridors where there's no rapid transit, no MX line. I think that where there's an MX line certainly should be the priority. Moreover, and I don't know if it's apples and oranges, Mayor, but I don't know if it's appropriate to ask or get a ballpark, or maybe it's for a future work session, but how much the city has fought or how much the city has spent to combat those who would want to challenge our housing policy reforms going above the state minimum standards. So whether I get that answer or not today, I suspect it's quite a lot, and I don't want us to go down that track again. So I'll be advancing option one. I really appreciate not only my colleagues' comments, but Leah, thank you for the presentation, and I hope we can learn from it and take appropriate steps in the near future.
Okay, thank you. Before I turn it back over to Matt for a motion, I can see where this is going, and so it seems like council's really of the same mind. I just want to question, I mean, both the Planning Commission and staff have recommended option 2, and I'm wondering if you just want to speak to, are there disadvantages to not designating more areas are there efficiencies or other benefits to sort of casting a wider net that we're missing here in this conversation? And manager, maybe you're.
Well, I unmuted, and this is probably going to take a couple of us to answer, but the ultimate recommendation that came from me is mostly based on, I support the direction of downtown only. I think, I'm always faced with what to recommend when you have a planning commission that you've designated that is recommending. So I tend to follow that unless there's some reason why not. And in this conversation, you get to set that direction. So we would support option 1 as well. But I think the what are we missing would be better answered by Terry or Leah.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, for the question. One thing I touched on lightly that we didn't get into in a lot of detail is that climate-friendly areas will be one of our land use efficiency measures during our UGB analysis. So that is a measure that you all who were around for the last UGB analysis will maybe recall is a strategy to use the land that's currently inside the urban growth boundary more efficiently. So get more housing, more jobs out of the land that we have before expansion. So climate-friendly areas designation will be one of our efficiency measures. We'll be bringing more to you next year. So by designating less land, we'll get a little bit less impact from it as a land use efficiency measure in that broader UGB analysis work. So it's a consideration. There's others that will bring you, as I said, and it's kind of a balancing of how much efficiency to drive within our current urban growth boundary versus kind of our larger analysis. So that's the one thing I would point to. I don't have great numbers to give you yet in terms of the difference between the impact of option 1 and option 2 as an efficiency measure, but that is the one thing I would call out.
Okay, that is helpful. Thank you for that. All right, I guess I will turn it back over to Matt to put a motion on the table, unless there's any other comments before we do that. Okay, go for it, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. Move to initiate and direct the city manager to prepare a package of land use code and plan amendments designating as climate-friendly areas those identified in option 1 as described in our AIS.
Second.
Hey, any other comments or questions? All right, all in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh gosh, everyone just moved. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm missing an 8 because I think Greg just, oh, there he is. 9. Got it, 8. Got it. Thank you. I can count to 8, really. Give it a chance. I can count to 8. Thank you. That passes unanimously, and appreciate the information and the conversation. And so with that, thank you again. I think we're ready to make the transition to our second work session, Eugene Youth Opportunities and Challenges, and I'll let the city manager introduce that.
Thank you, Mayor. I've been really looking forward to this session, and I have to say it paired up nicely with the work session poll that was put out around kind of what's happening with mental and behavioral health in our community. We were already kind of going down this road based on some conversations I was having in the community and feeling like, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about land use and things like that, but we don't often spend a lot of time talking about youth, and thought it was important, given some of what I was hearing, that we all have kind of a shared understanding of kind of the state of youth in Eugene. And so when Josh started, we had this conversation, and it is nesting nicely into this kind of trifecta of work sessions you're having. So with that, I will turn it over to our LRCS director, Joshua Bates.
Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council. My name is Joshua Bates, and I'm the Executive Director of Library, Recreation, and Cultural Services. So let me share my screen. I do have a presentation for all of you, and then I will hop into it. Okay. 1 second. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Is that working? Okay. So let me start by saying the subject of this work session is difficult. It's about our youth, the children here in our community. They're oftentimes the most vibrant and creative members of the city of Eugene, but they're also the most vulnerable. So changes and conflict and issues, it disproportionately impacts them. And while they're adaptive, I mean, every generation is, they're also struggling. They're experiencing negative outcomes amongst many of the indicators of well-being, but especially around mental health. So while today I'm going to be providing an overview around trends for youth, both nationally and locally, and information on how us as a community and us as the city of Eugene are supporting youth, I don't want it to get lost amongst all this data that these are individuals. These are kids that have dreams and ambitions and hopes. And in families and loved ones, they may actually be members of our families. And oftentimes they do not have the support that they need to thrive. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I'd like to begin with a quote. When we see the face of a child, we think of the future. We think of their dreams about what they might become and what they might accomplish. This is from Desmond Tutu, who was an anti-apartheid activist. I was really thinking about this on the way to work today after I dropped my daughter off. She's about to be 5, and she's absolutely obsessed with becoming an astronaut. We talk about stars, we talk about space, we talk about all these things every single day. What we don't talk about are the challenges that she's going to have to contend with. Challenges that will impact her ability to achieve that dream and impact actually her mental health. These include climate change, political unrest, social media and cyberbullying, economic insecurity, or just the very real realities around the stress that youth are experiencing around academic performance. She was also born at the beginning of COVID-19, and like many children and many of us, she was socially isolated for a very long time, especially here in Oregon. And when we see youth here in our community, they're all reckoning with this. They're reckoning with the impact of being isolated and about having fears around the future, not just around climate change, but their place in the future. And so actually, before I hop into this, I want to say something else. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke at the Mayor's Youth Council and shared a draft of this presentation. I shared the statistic that 75% of youth in Lane County have felt anxious in the last several days. One of the youth actually interrupted me. She raised her hand. It wasn't an interruption. She raised her hand and wanted to say something. And I called on her. And what she said is, she's like, Joshua, that's likely an undercount. And for me, that was striking to think that over 75% of youth here in Eugene are experiencing anxiety in 11th grade. And many of these data points are reflected on a national scale. So I'm just going to read through this slide, but I also wanted to say that this is by no means all-encompassing. In the AIS, you'll see that there's far more data that points to the bleak picture of youth mental health across this country. So these are from 2022. 44% of high school students report persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. 20% of young people have a mental, emotional, or behavioral health disorder that's been diagnosed. 10% of U.S. youth have severe major depression that affects how they function. 15% of 12 to 17-year-olds have experienced a major depressive episode in the last year. And 20% of high school students have considered suicide in the last 12 months. 4.6% of those were serious thoughts. Essentially, among all areas of mental health, in 2022, we were at an all-time high. And while things have gotten slightly better in 2024 than they were in 22, if we were to eliminate 2022 and just look at the axis of and change from 2010 to 2024, 2024 would be the highest and the worst outcomes for youth mental health since things have been measured. I also want to say too that one of the really bleak things that I identified through this is that between 2010 and 2020, the suicide amongst adolescents 10 to 12 or 10 to 14 has more than doubled. So it's not just that it's negative outcomes for mental health amongst youth, it's that this is happening to younger and younger kids. And this impact is disproportionate. If you're experiencing some form of marginalization, the outcomes are even worse. For instance, Indigenous youth have suicide rates nearly 3.5 times higher than the national average. LGBTQ+ youth are more than twice as likely to experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness and are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. Over half of transgender and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide. And Black youth are 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress, but are less likely to receive adequate mental health care. So while this is by no means comprehensive, other groups that are marginalized, other intersections of identity that youth are experiencing also have terrible outcomes. This is really meant to show that it's disproportionate. I also want to say too, going back to the Youth Advisory Council, something that the co-chair said to me really has stuck with me as well. She said that bullying during COVID-19 all went online, and much of that bullying happens around identity. And unfortunately, when things have returned to being in person, that bullying is no longer just online anymore. That bullying, that caustic and oftentimes racist and sexist and transphobic discourse, that's happening in person now. That's happening in our classrooms, that's happening in our hallways, that's happening in our community. So going to Oregon, I'm not going to provide a comprehensive overview of the behavioral health system. I think that was really well done a couple of weeks ago. But what I do want to say is that the outcomes for mental health for youth in Oregon are just as dire as they are amongst adults. We're actually the last in youth mental health outcomes and access to care amongst all 50 states and also Washington, D.C. And less than half of youth in Oregon have necessary treatment. In fact, Governor Kotek identified a priority around youth behavioral health that was to ensure access to services that promote social and emotional wellness, especially for our children and youth who have been particularly traumatized during the pandemic. So the governor recognizes too that during the pandemic, that isolation and that impact was especially intense for youth. Also on a state level, the state Senate passed this act called Addie's Act, this Senate bill, which requires each school district to have a plan and protocols around suicide. And also the Oregon Department of Education has provided curriculum support for socio-emotional learning across the state. So really at a state level too, our systems are being activated to support our youth. This graphic was pulled from from the U.S. Surgeon General's advisories on youth. And I think it's a really useful way to think about where we fit in as a jurisdiction in terms of supporting our youth. Each level of this, so each level of a child's life impacts their outcomes when it comes to mental health. That's from a society level, that's on an environmental level, that's on a community level, a family level, and an individual level. And really, when it comes to the city of Eugene, I think that we fit in well on the environmental level, the community level, and supporting families and the individuals. So for us, it really shows up with what types of spaces we are creating. How are we creating opportunities for folks to come together as a community to support youth, but also creating opportunities for youth to cultivate relationships with caring adults? How are we providing resources to families and individuals, or even just spaces where kids can be kids and kids can also access resources at their own discretion? So this is, oh, oops, I did not mean to move that fast. My apologies. I just went back a slide. Let me go back. So when I look at this, I think about how we as a jurisdiction fit into this framework, but also where other parts of our community, other organizations fit into this framework as well. So we're part of a greater system of organizations and initiatives that are engaging with youth. And really, I think that we're all part of a puzzle. We're all part of a village, if you will. So in preparation for this work session, I had dozens of conversations. I talked to both the superintendents from both Bethel School District and Fort Jay School District. I talked to Lane County Behavioral Health. I participated on the planning committee for the 2024 Behavioral Health Summit. As I said, I talked with the Mayor's Youth Advisory Council and talked to nonprofit service providers. These outcomes that I identify that are happening on a national level and on a state level, they're absolutely showing up in every single one of these systems. Furthermore, each of these systems, each of these organizations, and even in the discussions that I had, folks are trying to think about how they are best situated to be able to respond to this dire need that exists in our community. A need that is only going up post-pandemic. So an example of that would be in my conversations with the school districts, they've talked about greatly expanding their capacity to support the behavioral health needs of their youth. However, for instance, in Bethel, their wait list is just as long as it was when they had half of the staff that they do now around behavioral health support. Furthermore, they're partnering with other organizations in our community, nonprofit service providers, to provide wraparound support. And then also, we too are partnering with other organizations to be able to provide for those critical needs. But it's not just the critical needs. I think that you all have a really good picture of the critical needs. In these conversations, there was other themes that emerged. I'm so sorry that I keep hitting my scroll button. Some of these themes include the importance of reducing mental health stigma, the importance of having trusting and caring adults and safe spaces, the importance of prevention and partnership with that crisis response, the importance of affinity safe spaces where youth feel safe and feel supported in the totality of their identity, and crucially, the importance of the collaboration that I shared across these systems. Prevention is a crucial and oftentimes unrecognized part of the mental health system. And crucially, the city of Eugene, especially through library, recreation, and cultural services, provides a core service around that prevention. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is actually sharing my own experience. As I have shared sometimes before, I grew up very housing insecure. I lived in a number of different cities and ultimately went through, I believe, 9 different school districts. Oftentimes across all of that instability, it was the fact that there were libraries in each of those communities or programs in each of those communities that provided for that safety. I shared this last year at the Library Foundation dinner, but I do not know if I would have ever accessed college or knew what the future could hold for me if it wouldn't have been the support of a local youth librarian in one of those communities. So even when it comes to myself, I recognize the importance of those preventative interactions and those preventative relationships. And the next slide. So I just love quotes. This is one from John F. Kennedy. The future promise of any nation can be directly measured by the present prospects of its youth. And I think that, unfortunately, the prospects of our youth right now seem to be uniquely dire. In preparation, in another way I prepared for this presentation is I read this book called The Anxious Generation. And it was really asking the question of why. Why are things so bad now? And things that were highlighted were unfettered access to social media and technology, and a loss of a play-based childhood. Also in that research, it showed that the importance of third spaces where youth are able to be present and be safe. The importance of caring adults, once again. The importance of programs that destigmatize mental health, and also programs that allow kids to work in teams and create resiliency. And I think that really that spoke to me, that spoke to the work of library, recreation, and cultural services. Once again, going back to the Mayor's Youth Council, they talked to me about the power of our library, that it's a hub where they feel that they belong. One youth stated that getting a library card made her feel included and like the world opened up to her. The library intentionally cultivates environments where youth can both engage with information and programs and caring adults in a way that is even beyond just that initial interaction, to my point, to my experience. Also, the library partners with nonprofit organizations to provide coordinated support. We have things like an intergenerational Spanish program, programming for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We created a teen center that focuses and centers on the needs of teens. And we even have a little information box in the Tween Center that's in our children's area, where kids can ask questions and have those questions answered by our librarians. In recreation, we were one of the first jurisdictions in the entire country to create an LGBTQ youth group. It actually happened in the 90s. That group is still going on today. And that spirit of support is ubiquitous across recreation. We intentionally create spaces such as Vibe and Resolve, where youth can engage with peers and actually self-direct in terms of the service or the experiences they'd like to have. And we also have things like youth inclusion programs where we provide for the unique needs of developmentally different youth and ensure that those youth, regardless of what it is they're experiencing or their differences, are able to access our programs. A quote that I just remember as well is that in one of the moms reached out to Hilliard Community Center that is in South Eugene and shared that their 19-year-old son lives with autism and has few opportunities for social interactions. But the social activities through the summer programs at Hilliard allowed their son to gain confidence and explore his capabilities in a social setting. They were able to go on adventures, go out into nature. And ultimately, it was not just the highlight of their summer, it also sparked something in him. And also this happens in cultural services. In cultural services, we create spaces and opportunities for enrichment. Another member of the Mayor's Youth Advisory Council talked about how one of the cultural festivals that we fund showed her that the city of Eugene cared about her as an immigrant, cared about her and her family. And also, this doesn't just happen through the events, that it happens through the intentional channels that we create for youth to be able to engage with events such as Broadway and not just see themselves represented in the production of Broadway, but in the work of Broadway, and show that that youth, regardless of where you're from or regardless of your identity, you're able to ultimately be not just a part of a Broadway production, but able to be a part of this community. So while no community necessarily has this figured out when it comes to mental health, and also the crisis response is a core part of a mental health system, this preventative piece, the piece that really is on display through library, recreation, and cultural services, is a core component of a mental health response. And while this picture may be bleak, I do believe that through the coordinated response of LARCs of the city of Eugene and our partners and other providers and systems here in Eugene, that we are doing our absolute best to be able to respond to a dire need that exists across this country. So with that, I will now pass it back. I will pass it back to you, Sarah. That is the end of my presentation, but I'm more than happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is such a powerful presentation. And I heard the rough draft and now I've heard the final one. So thank you. Thank you very much. And I see that Mike has his hand up. So Mike, I'll let you kick it off.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, sir, for the presentation. That was wonderful. As the father of 2 children myself in our community that have grown up here, I understand the importance of that presentation in all of its details. The work is incredibly important. But I want to just ask a question, I guess, that's tangentially required, tangentially associated of the manager, I think. While I understand the importance, certainly at a very personal level, of all of the work that Library, Recreation, and Cultural Services is doing, and I'm glad to see that we're doing it. I'm proud of much of that work. I also remember the budget picture that we saw talking about the fire department getting 22% of general funds and Library, Recreation, and Cultural Services getting 16% of general fund. Do I have those numbers right in my recollection, manager?
You may be right, and I have that nearby. So if you want to continue with your question,
Yeah.
I will.
Well, it's that my concern in the budget discussions that we've been having recently, and they've been intense, and while contemplating new taxes and new fees in an environment where I'm not sure that's the wise course, I want to guard against what I fear the city is doing a bit, and that's mission creep. So while this is certainly an important area, health, mental health, these are county and state jurisdictions typically, and I have concerns that in moments like this, we look at how to take on more rather than maybe refine and strengthen that which we're doing well. And so I would look for any kind of recommendations in that regard from the manager, if those are coming forth at some point, on a focus to do what we're doing that's working better, and at the same time not be planning for growth in this area budgetarily when we're already in a kind of dire budget circumstance and don't have the money to spend on all manner of new programs. I just wondered if you want to comment on that, and if I'm right about the large portion of general fund monies that we're spending. And I have one last question at the end when you get done.
Sure, I'll address some of that. So I would say, I think you're right on the number. I presented that at a council meeting not that long ago. I feel like it was 16. The document I'm looking at is that I thought I had readily available is parsed out differently. But I would say we haven't been, what you're asking for of like, can we look at what we're doing and get more efficient and innovative? I'd say a couple of things. Over the last couple of budget cycles, we've been doing exactly that. We've been restricting, cutting those budgets, cutting it across LRCS. And we're currently under a review of our recreation system. And Josh can say more about that, but there was 2 areas that we committed to as part of the budget to taking a deeper look at and understanding better how this is, what are the best practices around the country. And one is around our central business functions, and one was around recreation and a little bit broader. So what you're saying is exactly what we've been doing. I think all of us understand the financial situation. It doesn't change the reality of sort of what's happening in our community with adults and youth and mental health issues.
And I guess 2 questions then. One, are we interacting with the county whose primary job this is in the best way possible? And the school district, I suppose. And lastly, with my last 7 seconds, I will ask then as well. I've been receiving emails, as we all have, from the Library Foundation about $0 going to, maybe I'll get a second round here.
Yeah,
and finish
why don't
that
I put
question.
you on this? Why don't I put you on it for a second round, Mike, so you
Thank
can
you, Mayor.
explain that question more fully. Okay, Lindsay and then Alan.
Thank you so much. I'm so deeply appreciative to be able to talk about this topic today as part of an overall mental health kind of series. I've spent the majority of my life, my career in children's behavioral health in organizations here in our area. And I transitioned into supporting the mental health of parents because, you know, Joshua, you mentioned kind of the isolation that babies and toddlers and little kids experience during COVID, but the difference between a baby or toddler child thriving in that isolation and them suffering in that isolation is absolutely 100% the parents' mental health. The parents have obviously the greatest influence over how that child is raised. And of course, we as a community have responsibilities to be able to foster good mental health for our people. Parenting these days is absolutely, completely different than even 20 years ago. Raising Generation Alpha is an entirely different experience, and we do not know how to do it. We don't. The digital age is a reality that we live in, and we have not been given any tools or any training or anything to be able to adequately prepare our children to be able to navigate that system. We are falling behind. I mean, I pride myself on being really good at technology, and yet I struggle every single day with an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old and how they're managing their selves in our digital environment, because it's so hard. So if we're going to take our efforts somewhere, I think there's so many opportunities to be able to start addressing, like, what are we doing and how are we supporting parents and how can we make some changes? And I don't know what the answer is at the city level. But to answer kind of Mike's thing, like, this is not mission creep. Every single dollar that we spent in prevention saves us hundreds of dollars down the line in enforcement, in crime, in suicide, I mean, every single aspect of what we do and what we pay for in our city is going to be impacted by the youth that are growing up today and are growing into adults in the future. So we absolutely need to invest whatever we can do to support our kids. And yes, the direct services are absolutely incredible. They are like stopgap, right? But what can we do to help the entire system and help start preventing these kids from harming themselves and being so anxious that they cannot become functioning adults? So I'll probably need another round. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have you for a second round. Alan.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua, for this presentation, and thank you for sharing your life experiences. I think we're really lucky to have you here at this time in this position. So thank you for what you're doing. You know, I just, every time I see this, and it's not the first time I've seen this stuff, the numbers are just so startling. They're so incredibly high. They should be in the single digits, and they're in the 50+% range. It's so disheartening, and it's such a huge unspoken problem in our country and in our city and our communities. That's why I co-authored that work session poll with Councillor Leach on mental health and substance abuse, because this is such a big problem. Unfortunately, I think it's just going to get worse, maybe even a lot worse. I haven't heard anything out of the next administration that lead me to believe they're going to address this issue or fund it at the federal level. Just the opposite. I think, like it or not, those that harass and threaten and hate are now going to feel emboldened by the unfortunate rhetoric and actions of Trump and his administration. That makes this doubly important. It also makes it doubly hard. I know the city of Eugene doesn't have a big role in this. It's mostly county, state, and school districts. And but I'm interested in how we can help. I like that, love that last slide, Joshua, with the 16 library recreational cultural programs that are on that slide. These programs that make a difference, that make our community safe and thriving, and it goes directly to why I so strongly oppose that kind of bottom-up budget philosophy, because the benefits, which are not readily seen, if we just focus on police and fire, all of that's at the expense and detriment of all these programs. And what I'm interested in is, how do we do more of this stuff? How do we rejigger the budget? How do we make this a bigger priority within what the city does, even though it's not our primary responsibility? But and in particular, as Councilor Leach said, the social media stuff, I think, is just so difficult, and we're not prepared to deal with it, and it makes it all that much harder. So I guess, Josh, you have any specifics about those 16 programs? Are great. They're probably way underfunded and underutilized. Where can we do more?
Well, I think actually, to Councilor Leach's point, no one really has this figured out, and it seems to be, to your point, Councilor Zelenka, that things are going to intensify. So I really do think that through this analysis that Sarah shared, that we're doing for library, recreation, and cultural services, it's going to be very important to be able to understand the efficacy of the things that we're doing, and also how we're measuring the things that we're doing. So so we can show how the work that we facilitate through the library, recreation, and cultural services is directly related to the positive outcomes when it comes to mental health amongst youth. I think this measuring our programs is a good place to start. And then that way we can understand where we should scale, and how also, not just through providing amazing and enriching programs, but through intentionally centering youth's mental health, that we're effective. So that's where I think there's a big opportunity. You're muted, Councilor.
You're muted, Alan.
Yeah, I think measuring is really key. That's a good point that you make. But I guess, how do you measure it? It's so amorphous, and you get these probably little changes. How do we see progress?
Okay, thank you. And I guess I'll turn this over to Randy and then to Greg.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, one of the most important responsibilities of a society is preparing the next generation. And I really believe that. And I know that a lot of these programs that live in LERCs are helping our youth. At the same time, there is the fiscal reality of what we have to deal with. It's our financial burn rate is burning at a faster rate than we have resources coming in, and at the same time, you know, it's always, we need more in all these areas. You know, one of the things I look at is, what has the growth been in various departments over the last 40 years? And you know, I know fire comes up a lot, and it hasn't grown. I mean, at all, hardly, at least not on line level response. And yet at the same time, look how much the library has grown. And I'm not arguing against it. It's an important resource. It's something that does a lot of good in our community, and I know the public loves it. But at the same time, there is the reality of what we can afford. I am very interested, as Councilor Clark said, of learning more about, you know, what is the county doing, and how do we better work with the county? They are our partners. They may not be adequately funded either. In fact, I'm sure they're not, but they are the ones that are charged with a lot of the mental health work. They've got the trained professionals. We don't. How do we better leverage that resource and use it towards some of the things that Josh brought out in his presentation? And by the way, thank you very much for the presentation. I appreciated it. But again, it's going back to, I see more our role of trying to provide, sports and facilities that can be accessed and utilized by kids sports, and bringing in some of our nonprofit partners as well. And you may say, well, sports, how's that connect with mental health? Quite a bit, I would say. It's learning how to work in that team environment. It's learning how to play well with others. It's learning self-discipline. It's also developing value of self. So whatever we can do to assist with that in the work that we're doing. I know we're looking at some new sports fields right now, which I think are important. But it's also trying to put this in perspective of the reality we are working with, and that is a very tight fiscal budget. And if we go ahead with some other fees that help support that, if we're spending as fast or faster than it's coming in, we're not fixing our problem. So I would just caution that we keep things in balance as we look at this. And I can see I'm running out of time. At this point, I don't need a second round, but I may. Thank you.
Okay, noted. Greg.
Thank you, Mayor. This situation really hits home for me personally. In January, my next door neighbor's son committed suicide. And this young man grew up with my sons and my daughter, and our families had Thanksgiving, Christmas dinner, birthdays together. I coach their kids, they coach mine. And then 6 months later, my son's best friend committed suicide. And so the impact that the inadequacy of the mental health services that we have in this community is deeper than some of us might think, and it's closer than what a lot of us realize. When those two situations happened to the family the families that I'm talking about, it literally destroyed those families. So whatever we can do to collaborate with our partners at the county, jurisdictionally and otherwise, to provide more support that our communities need and our school districts need is a critical piece here. I thank the Bethel School District for opening up the Willamette Auditorium for a memorial service for the young man that went to Willamette, went to Bethel schools, that died next door to me. I've got to tell you, Josh, I really thank you for the work that you're doing, because while we are all trying to do the same work and work with these families, clearly it's not enough, and we don't have enough resources to address the myriad of mental health issues that people in our community are experiencing, whether that be alcohol and drug abuse or just basic mental health issues that we from time to time we all deal with. So thank you and your team again for everything that you're doing. And I'm sorry that I'm rambling here, but this subject really hits home for me, particularly in the last few months. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you so much, Greg. Jennifer.
Thanks, Mayor. And thanks, Greg, for sharing that. I think that it's not only the right thing to do for cities to invest in our youth, but it's the smart thing to do. Because youth are our future, and we often say that, and then we add a but, and then go on, but we shouldn't add a but. They're our future workers, and our business owners, and our elected officials, and our city managers, and all the things, and not in the far distant future, in the very near future. These people will be, these youth in our communities will be all of us. And whether we provide them with the tools and the environments to thrive or whether we don't affects their future, but it affects all of our futures and the folks that aren't even born yet. And I appreciate you, Josh, coming here. And as I sit here, I'm trying to think, how can I be helpful to you? You don't need me to tell you we have a budget crisis. You know that. That's not helpful. And so I guess my question for you is, how can I be helpful for you today? Or are you just here to share information? Because I don't disagree with anything you've said. And I agree with the Youth Advisory Council that these numbers are probably very low from my own experience, from interactions with my children and my children's friends, and knowing about the continued stigma of admitting some of these things. Yeah, I'm sure it's much higher. So how do we help you?
So really the purpose of today was to provide this overview for all of you, and also really center our youth in this discussion around how they're doing and this around mental health. I think that continuing to consider that there are multiple pieces of this puzzle that support youth that both have to do with that crisis response, but also that interventions that provide opportunities for levity, that provide opportunities for kids to be kids, that get them off of their phones, that those are really an important piece too of that puzzle. So I think that at this point in time, that's what I would say. But I also think that this is going to continue to be a focus of the work of library, recreation, and cultural services, especially as we go through this analysis and we really consider our programs and their impact. So thank you for offering that, Councilor Ye.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess that gives me a question. I know you've obviously talked to the Youth Advisory Council. And is that your main conduit for getting feedback from younger generations when you're kind of thinking about your programming and your budget, or do you have other ways to kind of get that firsthand feedback?
For this presentation, that was the conduit. I think that across our programs, we have multiple ways we engage with youth, and then each of the divisions are finding more opportunities to center youth in their programs. I really also think it would be good to be able to convene additional youth regularly to be able to provide feedback, not just on what's working, but also what it is that they need. Because I do think that they know best. And ultimately, it's by talking to them and allowing them to have discretion over their lives that I think that that's a very powerful intervention as well.
Great thing. Thanks so much, Josh.
Thank you. I have 3 counselors wanting a second round. Matt, you had your hand up earlier. Did you want a first round, or are you passing on that?
If I can take my first round delayed, Mayor, and hear from colleagues, I'm putting my thoughts to paper, so I'm very crystal clear.
Okay, I will hold you back then. So then Mike and then Lindsay.
First thing, Josh, I want to say I didn't mean to jump straight to budgets and in any way diminish the power of what you were presenting, because as my colleagues have noted, it's very, very important work, and I would hate to have that misconstrued. Mike, I really appreciate Randy's and Greg's comments as well, because I think they come very close to where I was trying to go at the end of my comments, which is to a degree, a form of Jennifer's question. How best can we help you leverage the relationship with our partners and the work that they do in order to see best outcomes from all of us, all municipalities, all jurisdictions working together as a team? And I know that that's some of the work that you're currently doing, but do you have initial thoughts on that at all?
That question around coordination and almost having a continuum of opportunities and programs that are supporting youth, I think that that's still something that we do have a lot of work to do to figure out. I think it's happening really well in specific instances in our department. For instance, we have a program at Willamette High School through in partnership with our library. We also do things like bike safety with 4J schools. So it's program specific. I think actually taking a step back and figuring out where those gaps are and how we're uniquely situated to fill those gaps is something that we actually, and Larks especially, has some work to do. And that's where I think there's an opportunity for there to be more focus in the future, is figuring out how we fill in particular gaps that are appropriate to the types of services we provide. So it's not mission creep, but it is also it enhances the services that other organizations or systems are providing.
That's what I was getting to. That's a great answer. I appreciate that. I won't get into the national politics thing that my friend Alan decided to, but I will say I'm actually very hopeful that we will see less depression in the general community as our economy and nation improves dramatically. So while that's true, I do want to bring back to finish the budget question I was beginning to ask Sarah there, because it's germane. Well, I've seen a couple of different emails now, and it has to do with kind of lobbying council about how much money we're putting in and budgeting towards library. I've seen a graph by the Eugene Library Foundation and the Friends of the Library that shows $0 in last year's budget and this next towards, zero general fund dollars towards the library. And I'm wondering if you know about the email that we all just got either today or yesterday. I'll forward that to you because I'm very interested in knowing if they're putting out such information. Is it true? Is it not true? Is it misinterpreted in some way? Or are we maybe not looking at this the same way they are? I'm interested. Do you have any kind of reference to what the email I'm mentioning?
I don't know if I've seen the email that you're referencing. So if you forward that to me, I'm happy to fact verify from my perspective what's in there. I went back and looked at some of my numbers, so I'll just answer your question. When we went in and I was trying to understand the percent, if you were just going to do a across the board percent cut by department. So we went into the budget and we removed the one-time things and we just focused on the ongoing. That's where I got to the percent breakdown by department: 37.5% police, 22.5% fire, and about 16.2 on LRCS. And that number is accurate. And then, that said, library recreation took a pretty significant general fund reduction as part of the biennial budget, and then again as part of the supplemental budget.
Okay. Well, I'll forward that to you and I'll look forward to maybe some clarification. But I will say that those numbers, when they were first presented, were a little bit shocking to me proportionally. To Randy's point, that the degree of calls for service that we've had for fire and its percentage hasn't increased over time in the same way that we have spent on other upstream issues like this that are very important. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Lindsay and then Greg.
Thank you. And I apologize if it seemed like I was yelling at everybody earlier. I just am so passionate about this particular issue. I could yell from the rooftops. But I'm just so deeply appreciative that we can talk about it today. I think we've talked a lot about kind of the partnership with the county, and absolutely that's so incredibly important. But I want us to think a little bit more outside the box, because our mental health isn't just tied to availability of therapists, right? I'm really talking about preventative work, which is community building and connection building and reducing isolation and bringing people back together. And we have that unique capacity where the county isn't doing that direct city level work. So that their work is incredibly important, and our work is also incredibly important. And as a city, we really are tasked with the safety of our people. And we're talking, we talk about our law enforcement, our fire, our public works, our roads. These are all things that are specifically focused on keeping our people safe. And we are talking today that our children are not safe. They are not safe from our digital world, each other, and themselves. And that's devastating, right? And so to be able to focus on that and say, where can we be impactful, I think is is of the utmost importance to us as we are building our future. So, you know, we have all these beautiful community centers, we have all these beautiful community spaces. How can we continue to use those effectively, right? Like within our budget, and or bringing in additional dollars? Can we utilize those spaces to continue to build community, to bring in more, you know, parenting or youth, you know, focused work and workshops and classes, or, you know, what can we do more of that wouldn't, you know, really put us outside of the realm of possibility with our budget? I'm just, yeah, again, just incredibly grateful to be able to utilize this space to talk about that and how we can be creative and bring in additional partners. So I appreciate all my colleagues' concerns, or, you know, with our budget, it's completely real, but I think that we must keep working on this. So again, thank you.
Thank you for that. It is 1:30. I have Greg, probably Matt, and so can I just have a motion to extend by 10 minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hands. I think that was unanimous. Thank you. And all right, I'll turn it over to Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. One quick question for you, Josh, is given the nature of a lot of our marginal communities in terms of the realm of youth, whether that be youth of color or LGBTQ, how are we creating more points of access to mental health and community services for these groups, specifically since we have some real issues with aberrant behaviors going on in schools towards youth of color and towards LGBTQ youth that I know of personally, that I've experienced and seen. How are we enhancing what we already have in place, and how are we growing that given the constraints that we're under financially?
That's a really wonderful question, Counselor Evans. I think though the way that we are doing that now is primarily, it's oftentimes unique to the particular division. So for instance, in library, oftentimes what we do is we do partnerships, or we put on identity specific programs. In recreation, we do things such as affinity spaces, either youth groups, or we also even have youth trips, youth summer camps that are affinity based. I would in terms of scaling that to meet the need of our community, and also creating really clear channels to the more crisis response parts of mental health. I don't know necessarily if we've done that to scale other than in individual partnerships. So I do believe that there's some work to be done to be able to get to what you're pointing to, which is how do we support the ever-present unique needs that our marginalized communities have across the systems that we administer.
Okay, thank you. Matt. You're muted, Matt.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks for your patience, colleagues. Thank you. And Josh, always a pleasure to hear you tell your story. When I first saw you share your story with a crowd at a Eugene Public Library Foundation event, I was wowed, and you had the whole room on their feet. They were wowed as well. So it's always impressive and empowering and inspiring to hear you tell your story. Especially, I want to share my hope that your daughter continues to reach for the stars and achieve her dreams. I join my colleagues in wanting to keep our community safe, especially our youth. And as the biggest killer in our community, in our region, in our country is firearm related, I'm alarmed that the second highest cause of death among youth ages 5 to 18 is suicide. So from safe storage to tougher background checks to realistically creating firearm-free public spaces remain items of policy change that I continue to support and champion and long to advance. According to my research, 1/4 of adults, 1 out of 4 adults nationally, are realizing some semblance of mental health distress. Now, while 25% may seem high, as the conversation has unfolded, like a great many listening to this work session, I suspect it's actually quite low as it is, as the Youth Advisory Council has relayed in regards to youth numbers. In a post-pandemic, now endemic, digital, increasingly AI-generated, war-torn world in which climate crisis is worsening, there's clear economic unrest, extreme vitriol in our political discourse, bigotry, misogyny, homophobia, racism, and rampant online and off hate speech. One can make a strong argument, and those are just the hits that are coming from an incoming, increasingly hostile administration. This work is so very important. So I commend you, Josh. But I do have to ask, is this our role as a municipality alone? So I appreciate showing the opportunity for strengthening our partnership with 4J and with Bethel. I would add, as others have, Kids Sports and YMCA and a whole host of nonprofits to that work. From students to seniors, kiddos to veterans, I think it is important for us as a community, not just necessarily a city, but a society, to make it clear it's not only okay, it's cool to ask for help. So I would hope that we would stand with our Lane County behavioral health specialists and partners for increased funding and outreach. I appreciate the overview you've provided, and I would add, though it may not necessarily be our role as a local government, it's our shared responsibility as a society to destigmatize mental health support. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to comment as we close on a couple of things. And one is just thinking about the library, that one of the reasons the library, I mean, we've successfully passed and renewed a library levy because it is so highly valued by the public. So as you think of this, recognizing that this community created a stream of revenue in order to help sustain that really critical function because people want it. I would also, thinking about the upstream benefits, recall that it was our former Chief Zaludek who made the connection between literacy and survival of a fire. And because people who can't read the instructions. They don't read the alerts. They can't read how to use the fire extinguisher, that it is very related for us to be doing anything that actually promotes that sort of total learning. And then finally, I just want to close this with one more comment from the Youth Advisory Council session with Josh, which should be a reminder to all of us, which is that as he finished his presentation and asked if there were any other questions or comments, one student, followed by a couple of others, raised her hand and said that she had always felt that nobody was paying any attention, and that Josh's presence in the Youth Advisory Council that day, giving this presentation, gave her hope that the adult world was actually paying attention. And so we do have an obligation to pay attention to what the youth are struggling with in this community. And I think have such a strong foundation in LRCS and the programs that Josh has described to do that work. And I think a short-term crisis should not define a long-term solution. You know, the long-term solution is how do we invest in our youth? The short-term crisis is how do we come up with adequate funding to do that? So thank you all, Josh. Thank you again for really a phenomenal presentation and thought-provoking, and really appreciate all the comments from all of my colleagues on the council. So I think if there's no other comments, we are ready to adjourn. Thank you so much.